Driving through the forest was usually peaceful, but that night, it felt off. The tall trees seemed to close in, and the dirt road felt narrower than usual. I was delivering a load to a cabin deep in the woods. The owner had called for an urgent delivery, and even though I had a bad feeling, I took the job. The darkness was heavy, the only light coming from my truck's headlights. I could hear the engine humming and the leaves rustling. After a while, my GPS stopped working, and I had to use an old map. The cabin was supposed to be about 15 miles in, but after 20 miles, I still didn't see it. I pulled over to check the map again, and that's when I heard it. A soft, steady tapping. I turned off the engine to listen better. The tapping kept going, coming from the trees just beyond the road. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cold night air hitting me right away. I walked toward the sound, my boots crunching on the gravel. The tapping got louder, more urgent. I shone the flashlight around, seeing branches and leaves. Then I saw it, a cabin, barely visible through the thick trees, not far off the road. It wasn't the cabin I was supposed to deliver to, but I thought maybe someone there could help me. As I got closer, I noticed the door was slightly open, moving with the wind. The tapping was louder now, almost unbearable. I pushed the door open with my foot and stepped inside. The air was stale, and the place looked abandoned. Furniture was knocked over, and dust covered everything. The tapping was coming from an old grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging wildly even though the rest of it was broken. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. I turned to leave and noticed a photo on the floor, half buried under junk. It was a picture of a family, smiling. The date on the back was from over 20 years ago. I put it in my pocket, thinking I might find someone who knew them. I hurried back to my truck, the bad feeling growing. As I started the engine and drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. In the headlights, I saw movement at one of the windows. A shadowy figure standing there, watching me. I sped up, not stopping until I was far away from that place. I finally reached a gas station at the edge of the forest, the first sign of people in miles. I went inside and showed the clerk the photo. His face went pale. He told me that the family in the picture had disappeared without a trace years ago. The cabin had been empty ever since. I delivered my load the next day, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I never took another job that led me through that forest again. Every now and then, I think about the figure at the window, the steady tapping, and the abandoned cabin. It makes me wonder what else is out there, waiting to be found. Or worse, waiting to find us. I had rented a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods for a weekend escape. I wanted nothing more than some peace and quiet, away from the city's chaos. The place was old but cozy, with a wood stove and a tiny kitchen. I arrived late in the afternoon and settled in, enjoying the calm. That night, as I lay in bed reading, I heard a faint rustling noise coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal. But then, the noise came again, closer this time. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind. The next morning, I saw that a few branches were broken near the cabin. I thought it was probably from a storm or something. But the rustling noises kept up that night, louder and more persistent. I got up and checked outside, but saw nothing. By the third night, I was on edge. The noises had gotten worse, and now there was a scratching sound at the windows. I looked outside with a flashlight, but the darkness was too thick to see anything. I decided to stay awake, hoping to catch whatever was making the noise. I sat by the window, peering into the pitch-black night. Hours passed, and just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a loud thud against the cabin wall. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, my heart pounding. There, on the ground near the cabin, was a small ladder made from branches. It hit me then. The scratching was someone trying to climb up to the windows. I felt a jolt of panic and immediately locked all the doors and windows. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every little noise making me jump. As dawn approached, the sounds finally stopped. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking, and left as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. What chilled me to the bone was not just the thought of who might have been out there, but the realization that someone had left something behind, a small, dirty glove lying on the ground by the cabin. It was too small to be mine. I never found out who or what had been trying to get in, but as I drove away, I noticed the glove's fingers were stained with something dark and sticky. I felt a cold sweat on my back, knowing that whatever happened that night, it wasn't over yet. I needed a break from my busy life, so I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains for a few days. It was a small, cozy place with wooden walls and a fireplace. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the quietness was just what I needed. On the second night, I woke up to a strange noise outside. It sounded like branches snapping underfoot. I sat up in bed, listening. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal. I told myself not to worry and tried to go back to sleep. But the noise continued. I got out of bed, put on my shoes, and grabbed a flashlight. I opened the door slowly, the cold air hitting me immediately. I shined the light around but saw nothing. The forest was dark and dense, the trees casting long shadows. Just as I was about to go back inside, I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from the side of the cabin. I walked slowly, my heart pounding. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. Around the corner, I saw something that made me freeze. There were footprints in the dirt, but they weren't animal tracks. They were human, and they were fresh. My mind raced. I was supposed to be alone out here. I followed the tracks a few more steps and then stopped. There, nailed to the side of the cabin, was a small, weathered piece of paper. It fluttered slightly in the breeze. I reached out, my fingers shaking, and pulled it down. In the beam of the flashlight, I read the message scrawled in messy handwriting. "Leave now." I didn't wait to find out who left it or why. I ran back inside, locked the door, and packed my things as quickly as I could. The noise outside started up again, louder and more insistent. I could hear footsteps now, moving around the cabin. I grabbed my keys and dashed to my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the narrow dirt road, not looking back. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still pounding when I reached the main road. I never told anyone about what happened that night. I don't know who left that note or what their intentions were, but I never went back to that cabin. The peace and quiet I wanted turned into a night of terror, and I was just glad to get out of there alive. I thought a weekend away in a cabin would be just what I needed. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far from the city's noise. The drive had been long and twisting through dense forest, but I finally arrived as the sun was setting. The cabin looked charming with its old wooden exterior and a small porch overlooking a peaceful lake. I unpacked my bags and got comfortable, enjoying the quiet. I lit the fireplace to keep warm since the temperature was dropping fast. The crackling fire was the only sound, and it felt like a perfect escape. I decided to take a walk around the cabin before it got too dark. When I stepped outside, the thick forest surrounded me. The sun had almost vanished, leaving just a faint light through the trees. I walked around the cabin, enjoying the peace, when I noticed something strange: fresh footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They were bigger than mine and seemed like they had been made recently, as if someone had been walking around here just a short while ago. I felt a chill. It was probably just someone else staying nearby, but it was strange because I hadn't seen any other cabins on the way here. I decided to ignore it and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The evening passed without any trouble, and I went to bed early, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling a deep sense of dread. I lay still, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind outside was howling through the trees. Then I heard something that made my heart pound, a scraping sound, like something was being dragged along the cabin's walls. I listened carefully, trying to figure out what it was. The sound stopped, leaving only the howling wind. Despite my fear, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door, shining it into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing unusual. I walked around the cabin, but the scraping sound had stopped completely. When I reached the back of the cabin, my flashlight revealed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints I had seen earlier were now accompanied by deep, wide scratches on the cabin wall, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside. Panic gripped me. I ran back inside, locked the door, and checked all the windows. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. I listened for any sounds, the wind still howling outside. As dawn approached, I felt a bit safer and decided to leave early. My need for safety was stronger than any desire for solitude now. I packed up quickly and left, driving back to civilization with my heart racing. As I glanced back at the cabin through my rearview mirror, I felt a shiver. The woods seemed even darker and more threatening. And then I noticed something that made me freeze. In the dirt where the fresh footprints had been, there were new ones, small, unsteady footprints, as if someone had been walking around the cabin while I was inside. I didn't know who or what had been out there with me that night, but one thing was clear: whatever it was still watching. I took a week off from work and decided to rent a cabin in the woods. I needed a break from the noise of the city and thought some peace and quiet would do me good. The cabin was small but cozy, deep in the forest, far from any town or road. It had a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. There was no phone service and no internet, just the way I wanted it. The first few days were perfect. I spent my time reading, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. On the fourth day, I decided to explore further into the woods. I packed some water and snacks, locked up the cabin, and set out. The forest was thick, and the air was fresh. I followed a narrow path that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the woods. After a couple of hours, I found an old, abandoned campsite. There were the remains of a fire pit and a few rusty pieces of camping gear scattered around. It looked like no one had been there for years. I felt a chill run down my spine but brushed it off as just the spookiness of the place. I decided to head back before it got too dark. On my way back, I started to feel like I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me jump. I walked faster, but the feeling didn't go away. I reached the cabin just as the sun was setting. I locked the door and closed all the curtains. The feeling of being watched stayed, even inside the cabin. That night I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made my heart race. I told myself it was just animals, but it didn't help. Around midnight, I heard something outside, near the back of the cabin. It sounded like footsteps. My heart was pounding in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the back window. I shone the light outside but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer. I got up and tiptoed to the front door. I looked through the peephole and saw a shadow moving outside. Panic set in. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stood by the door, listening. The shadow moved away, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I packed my things and left the cabin. I drove away, not looking back once. Back in the city, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched never really left. I started noticing shadows in the corners of my apartment, faint sounds that didn't belong. It wasn't just in my head. Whatever had been in the woods followed me back. I started to find small things moved around my place, items I was sure I had put in one spot showing up in another. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was nothing. But one night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the same footsteps from the cabin, now inside my apartment. My heart pounded as I stared at the ceiling, too scared to move. The footsteps grew closer, stopping right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, hoping it was a dream. But then the door slowly creaked open, and I knew the peace I sought in the cabin had turned into a nightmare that would never end. Now, every night, I hear those footsteps, getting closer and closer. I don't know how long I can take it before I break. The cabin in the woods was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but it turned into a reminder that sometimes, the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. And some of those secrets follow you home. I was driving down Route 66 late at night, and it always creeped me out. The road seemed to go on forever, with just the occasional flicker of my headlights and the soft hum of the engine for company. Approaching an old, rusty sign that said, "Next gas station 50 miles." My heart sank. The fuel gauge was dangerously low. I kept going, hoping to reach the next town before I ran out of gas. Minutes turned into hours in the darkness. Suddenly, a thick fog rolled in, making it hard to see. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, peering through the mist for any signs of the road ahead. Then I saw it, a figure standing by the roadside. My heart skipped a beat as I drove past, catching a glimpse of a tattered jacket and an old hat. A hitchhiker, maybe, but who would be out here at this hour? A chill ran down my spine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. Had they vanished into the fog or slipped back into the darkness? The engine coughed and died. Panic surged as the car coasted to a stop. Out of gas. In the eerie silence, I cursed and checked my phone. No signal. I was truly alone, stranded on this lonely highway. I decided to walk, hoping to find help. The fog obscured everything, making every step uncertain. Time dragged on as I trudged forward, my senses on edge with every shadow and sound. Suddenly, headlights cut through the mist, a truck slowing down as it approached. Relief flooded over me as I waved desperately, explaining my situation to the driver. He nodded and offered to take me to the next gas station. During the drive, he shared stories of strange happenings along this deserted road. I listened, uneasy but grateful for his company and the warmth of the truck's heater against the cold night. Eventually, the lights of a small town appeared on the horizon. The driver dropped me off at a gas station, where I filled my tank and thanked him profusely. Glancing back at the dark highway, now distant and quiet, I realized how close I had come to a different fate. As I drove away, relieved to leave the eerie highway behind, a chill ran down my spine again. In the rearview mirror, for a split second, I thought I saw a faint figure standing by the road where the truck had picked me up. But as quickly as I noticed, it vanished into the night. I work as a freelance writer and needed a quiet place to focus on my new project. The city was too noisy, so I rented a small cabin deep in the woods. It was a basic, old cabin, far away from the nearest town. It seemed like the perfect spot to get some peace and quiet. The first few days went great. I woke up early, wrote for hours, took long walks, and enjoyed the silence. But on the fourth night, things took a turn. I had just finished dinner, and was relaxing by the fire, reading a book. That's when I heard it, a soft, steady tapping on the window. I tried to ignore it at first, but it kept going. I went to the window and looked out. The night was dark, and the trees cast long shadows. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. I figured it was probably a branch or an animal. I went back to my book, but the tapping started again, louder this time. My heart began to race. I decided to check outside. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The cold night air stung my skin. I looked around but didn't see anything. I walked around the cabin, shining the light into the woods. Everything seemed normal, but I still felt uneasy. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. That night I barely slept. Every sound seemed louder. The wind blowing through the trees, the cabin creaking, even my own breathing. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. I tried to shake off the fear and focus on my work, but I couldn't concentrate. The next night, the tapping came back, and this time it was even more insistent. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I took my flashlight and a kitchen knife for protection. I went outside, determined to find out what was causing the noise. The night was strangely quiet, except for the tapping, which was now coming from the back of the cabin. I moved slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As I got closer to the back, the tapping stopped. I stood still, listening. Then I heard rustling in the bushes. My heart pounded as I moved closer. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man, looking dirty and disheveled, holding a stick he had been using to tap on the window. He seemed as shocked to see me as I was to see him. Without saying a word, he turned and ran into the woods. I stood there, frozen, until he disappeared from view. I rushed back inside, locked the door, and checked all the windows. I couldn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the cabin. As I drove away, I felt a chill that I couldn't shake off. I told the local authorities about what happened, but they weren't very concerned. They said it was probably just a drifter or someone from a nearby town. But I knew something wasn't right. Someone had been watching me, and they had been right outside my window. I never went back to that cabin. The quiet I had sought had turned into a nightmare. Now, whenever I write late at night, I can't help but glance at the windows, making sure no one is out there. The woods now seem more like a place of danger than solitude. The tapping on the window was a reminder that sometimes, when you think you're alone, there's always something lurking just beyond the darkness.